Well, hey, you guys, welcome back to Flickers of Fear. Now, I know the last couple of videos I did were new movies, and I am still trying to do that because I do want to do a year end video. Whether I'll get it done or not, I don't know, but I am kind of like shooting for it. However, I guess because this week is Halloween, I sort of wanted to talk about a classic movie that I haven't talked about before, and somebody actually requested that I do this one. So I decided now was as good a time as any to cover this classic film from the 1940s. Now, most horror fans with knowledge of kind of the classics or, the golden era of horror films will have likely heard of the 1945 British anthology film Dead of Night. This was actually not only one of the very few horror films to come out in the UK in the 1940s. There was kind of like a little bit of a embargo, or you weren't really allowed to make them, but a few of them did kind of come out. But this movie was actually massively influential, particularly in the horror anthology subgenre going forward. In addition to that, its iconic final segment about an evil ventriloquist dummy has turned up on several kind of scariest horror scenes or whatever, like lists over the years, and has inspired many similarly themed movies about equally evil ventriloquist dummies, pretty much right up until the present day. So Dead of Night actually consists of essentially like 5 stories told within this really good, like suspenseful frame narrative. Now, I admit I could have done without the one comedic segment, but overall, this was a very, very decent slice of 1940s horror goodness. Kind of pretty spooky in places. It's pretty fun. It's very nicely shot, nice cinematography, and actually does go like kind of genuinely atmospheric at times. So in the frame story, we have this architect named Walter Craig, and he's arriving at this big old country house. So he has been summoned there, we find out, by the guy who owns the place, presumably, whose name is Elliot Foley, and he wants Walter to consult on some renovations, because he's having renovations done around the house. Also present at the house, I guess it's some kind of dinner party or everybody just dropped by or something like that, is like some friends of Elliot's. One of them is a psychologist whose name is Dr. Van Straten. One of them is a race car driver whose name is Hugh Granger. One of them is like kind of a teenage girl, maybe a high school or college student. Her name is Sally O'Hara. And one is kind of this woman who's, I'm guessing, kind of like a socialite or something like that, whose name is Joan Cortland. Now, I will say, like I said, this frame story is actually really great, and your interest is like piqued almost immediately because within minutes of arriving, Walter insists that he has had a recurring nightmare about this house and all the people that are there, even though he's never set foot in this place before and has never met any one of them before, which, like I said, it's a great setup. Now, most of the guests are fascinated by this, as you would be, and they just very eagerly like ask him about the dream, like, ooh, what happens in it? You know what I mean? Now, Dr. Van Straten, being a psychologist, is very skeptical about this, though. And he's like, look, man, it's probably a coincidence. You probably just saw all these people somewhere before. Maybe you saw them walking around in the street in the town, or maybe like because some of them had their pictures in the paper for various reasons. And maybe you saw them then and it just kind of like went into your subconscious and you dreamed about them. You know what I mean? I will say that as the movie goes on, this explanation becomes slightly less tenable because Walter is actually able to accurately predict a few kind of minor things before they happen. Now, other than Dr. Van Straten, the remaining guests in the house believe that Walter really did dream about this whole situation, and kind of in solidarity with him, I guess, they each start telling their own story about a time when something seemingly supernatural happened to them too. Now, the first to speak up is Hugh Granger, who tells the group about this anecdote when he was hospitalized after a terrible car racing accident. Because remember I said he was a race car driver. Now, this particular story was probably the most familiar one to me because it's a variation of the fairly well-known E.F. Benson story, The Bus Conductor, which came out in the early 20th century. In this version, Hugh is kind of recovering in his hospital bed, and though it's ostensibly the middle of the night, like the time on the clock on the nightstand like inexplicably changes, and Hugh goes over to the window and pulls aside the curtains and sees that not only is it full daylight out, but there's this horse-drawn hearse like parked below his window, almost like it's waiting for him. Now, Hugh looks down, kind of freaked out about this, obviously, and then the hearse driver looks up at him and says, "Just room for one inside, sir." Now, Hugh, again, freaks out, but when he looks again, the hearse is gone. Now, sometime later, Hugh is released from the hospital and goes to board a bus to take him home. But the bus conductor looks just like the hearse driver from the dream or vision or whatever that he had, and he says the exact same words to him, like, just room for one inside, sir. Hugh is just like, fuck this noise, and he just steps right back off the bus, and then the bus pulls off, and Hugh kind of watches helplessly as it drives off without him, loses control, and plunges down an embankment, presumably killing everyone who was on the bus, other than him, because he didn't get on. So we go back to the frame story then, and Dr. Van Straten kind of attempts to explain away Hugh's experience, saying, well, the hearse thing was probably just a dream, and the bus conductor probably didn't even look like the hearse driver from your dream. You just perceived that he did, and it was close enough that it wigged you out and you got off the bus, you know what I mean? Now, the others kind of chide the doctor for being such a stick in the mud, and then the teenage girl, Sally, starts to tell her story. So she says she was at this Christmas party at a mansion with a bunch of other teenagers who all have costumes on. So I'm like, must be one of those Halloween Christmas parties that I've always heard about. So the kids all decide to play hide and seek. And so they all kind of scatter around to find, hiding spots, obviously. Now, Sally initially hides in this sort of window alcove deal, like behind this big curtain. But her friend Jimmy finds her, like, right away. And essentially says, it's kind of a shitty hiding spot. Let's go find a good one. So they go upstairs to this sort of attic type area, and they sort of get separated. And then Sally finds like a hidden door, and then she hears a little boy crying, and she goes in there, and she finds this little boy who's like crying in a chair, and he says his name is Francis Kent. And she asks him what's wrong, and he says that he's afraid that his sister Constance wants to hurt him. So Sally, like, reassures the kid. It's like, oh, I'm sure everything's fine. Like, I'm here now. Nothing bad will happen to you. And she puts him to bed. And then she goes back downstairs and, like, finds her friends or whatever. And she tells the others about the kid, but none of them know what the hell she's talking about because there isn't supposed to be anyone else in the house. So she tells them what the boy's name is. And Jimmy's like, you must have heard about the murder that happened here, like, back in the 19th century. She's like, what murder? Like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And then the others explain the little boy named Francis Kent was murdered in this very house by his sister Constance back in the 1800s. So obviously the little boy she saw was a ghost. Incidentally, Sally's story is based on a real 1860 murder case in which a 16-year-old girl named Constance Kent brutally stabbed her 3-year-old half-brother, Francis Saville Kent, and then threw his body down the privy, like the outhouse type thing. There's actually a fantastic book about this case that I read years and years ago. It's called The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher by Kate Summerscale. And if you're really into true crime, especially if you like Victorian era true crime, I really recommend it. It's a great book. So anyway, Dr. Van Straten has a little more trouble explaining Sally's account away, but he's just like, oh, you probably heard about the murder and forgot about it or whatever. You know what I mean? He's always got an explanation. At this point, Joan Cortland volunteers to tell her story, which is a little bit more intense, I guess, than the ones that came before. So she says that she bought this beautiful antique mirror as a birthday present for her fiancé, Peter. Now, he loved it and he put it in his bedroom, but not long afterward, he starts seeing a different room reflected in the mirror, like not the room that he's actually in. The one that he sees is kind of like fancy. It has like wood paneling. There's a fireplace and a big 4-poster bed. Now, sometimes the reflection looks like it's supposed to, like it's the actual room that he's in. But as time goes on, he starts seeing this other room with more and more frequency, and it's starting to wig him out a little bit because he's starting to feel as though this room is somehow trying to trap him. Now, Joan and Peter get married, and they bring the mirror with them to their new house, even though he's already started to complain. It's like that he's kind of weirded out by this mirror. And Joan's like, look, don't feel, but you can get rid of it if you want. It's like, just because I bought it for you, you don't like feel the need to keep it if it's bothering you. But he's kind of weirdly fascinated by it, or maybe enthralled by it, perhaps. So he's kind of like reluctant to part with it, even though it's freaking him out. Now, Joan kind of attempts to get him to see, she's like, look, you're not crazy. You're just imagining things. Maybe it's the stress of the wedding. You're tired or whatever. And this does actually kind of work for a short time. Like, she actually kind of talks him out of seeing the other room. But it doesn't really work for long. And honestly, she has him in there, like in the room, and she's looking in the mirror too. And obviously she just sees normal shit. but she sees firsthand that Peter is completely convinced that he sees a different room than she does when he looks in the mirror. And what's more, he actually can't see Joan reflected in the mirror even when she's standing right next to him. So Joan is obviously really troubled by this. She had scheduled to go visit her mom like for a few days, like I guess like in a neighboring town. It's not that far away. And so while her and her mom are out shopping, Joan passes the store where she bought the mirror. So she decides she's going to pop in and ask the proprietor about where it came from. Now, she also notices in the shop that there's a big 4-poster bed in the shop, just like the one that her husband described, like from the mirror room. And the antique dealer tells her that both the mirror and the bed came from the same estate sale, and that the owner of both pieces of furniture, there was also a painting of him there, had actually strangled his wife to death after suspecting, erroneously, that she was having an affair, and then he committed suicide by slashing his own throat. So Joan is now absolutely sure that Peter is having a legitimate supernatural experience and is somehow seeing this dude's room, you know what I mean? So she goes back home to tell him what she found out, but Peter accuses her, wrongly, of seeing another man, like when she was just visiting her mom, and attempts to kill her, just like the last guy did. Now, thankfully, she smashes the mirror before he can finish the job, and it snaps him out of the spell, and he doesn't even remember, like, doing any of that. So it's implied that Peter was perhaps possessed by the man who had owned the mirror and was kind of doomed to possibly repeat his crimes. But obviously that didn't quite happen because she broke it. She broke the thing. So after she's done with her story, everyone's pretty stunned by this. And they're like, man, sorry that happened to you. You know what I mean? Because, you know, her husband almost killed her. That's a little upsetting. And then the homeowner and also the host of this little shindig, Elliot, he throws his hat into the ring, as it were, and begins telling his own story. Now, Elliot's story is based on another fairly well-known story, the story of the Inexperienced Ghost by H.G. Wells. And this is the only comedic installment in the film. It is entertaining to a degree, but I admit it sort of lets the air out of the movie sails a little bit. I get the impression that because the previous story and the one following it, like the one, you know, the other side of the sandwich, you know what I mean, are much darker, this funny one's kind of wedged in there to maybe lighten the mood and give the audience a breather or something like that. I've noticed that some horror anthologies still do this, like to this day, like they feel the need to put at least one lighthearted or funny story in there, like in order to break the tension, I guess. I mean, I've never really liked it and I don't get it, but you know, what are you gonna do? So anyway, Elliot's story doesn't actually involve him personally, but is instead an account of two golfing buddies named George and Larry, who are both madly in love with the same woman whose name is Mary Lee. Now, because Mary Lee cannot decide which of these dumpy middle-aged dudes she likes the most, George and Larry decide to play a round of golf for her. Like, the winner will get Mary Lee, and the loser gets lost. So, long story short, George wins the game, but it's pretty clear that he cheated, despite his insistence to the contrary. Bizarrely, after the game is over, Larry, the loser, he just walks into the lake on the golf course and drowns himself. And George and the two caddies just stand there doing absolutely fuck all. Like, nobody even says, hey, Larry, what you doing? Or tries to stop him or anything like that. It's really, really weird. They just stand there and watch him walk in there. Then he just drowns and they're just like, huh, okay. So George, obviously not upset at all that his best friend, I'm presuming, is dead now, he starts to kind of woo Mary Lee, and soon enough they get engaged. But Larry, it turns out, isn't done with George just yet, and starts haunting his cheating ass. Now, George can see him, but nobody else can, so there are kind of a few amusing scenes of people watching George talking and gesturing to someone who isn't there, and things of that nature. So Larry basically says that he's going to hang around indefinitely, unless George gives Mary up for good, since he got her by cheating at the golf game. And he finally does admit, yeah, I cheated. And they're like, yeah, duh, we know. Now, George does agree to do that, but then he just kind of blows Larry off and then just ends up marrying her instead. So Larry subsequently becomes a real fucking pesky pants, and he even threatens to fuck up all of George's golf games in the future, because there's a scene where he keeps moving the ball and all this other kind of shit. And since George clearly loves golf more than he loves his paramour, this woman he's gonna marry, that's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, right? So he's like, okay, tell you what, I will leave Mary, like, if you will stop haunting me. Not so fast, though. It seems that after this whole bargain is struck, Larry discovers that he has forgotten how to vanish, you know? So he keeps doing this series of, like, really ridiculous, like, hand gestures. I don't even know. He's, like, doing the hand jive or whatever. Like, I was making hand jive jokes, like, the whole time. And he claimed, like, he learned how to do it, like, in ghost school or whatever the fuck they do when you get over there. But he's not disappearing. Like, he's not doing it right. Now, George, who is desperate to get rid of this cock-blocking ghost, tries to help him remember the vanishing spell, but he can't figure it out either. So this whole silly charade continues until George's wedding night. And it's actually sort of funny, like, seeing George kind of attempting to delay consummating the marriage with Mary, because Larry's right there, but Mary can't see him, you know what I mean? So he's just like, ooh, look at all this golf trophy and that golf trophy. And she's like, what the fuck? Like, let's go have sex, you know what I mean? Ghost Larry's going to be right there watching them as they bang, like, very kinky. So, so obviously George is uncomfortable by that. Now, at last, George attempts to suggest some gestures of his own and ends up making himself vanish, even though he is presumably still alive, and this turn of events makes absolutely no sense within the context of the story. But again, what are you going to do? So Ghost Larry, still stuck in the material plane, then just kind of shrugs like, oh well, and he makes his way toward the bedroom, where Mary Lee is presumably waiting for George to dick her down, right? I guess little does she know, she's going to be getting some Invisible Man action this evening, rather than the corporeal pork sword she was probably expecting. So after this story is completed, the assembled people, they kind of chuckle heartily at the whole thing. And Elliot basically implies that the story didn't really happen, which but he just told it because everyone else was telling one and he felt left out. And I was like, way to be an attention whore, Elliot. So at this point, the rest of the party start asking Dr. Van Straten, the skeptic, what his story is. It's like, yes, he's a man of science and blah, 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 but surely he must have had something strange or inexplicable happen over the course of his long career, right? So the doctor admits, finally, yes, there was one really odd case. And he proceeds to tell what is probably the most fondly remembered story in the whole movie. He says he was a consultant on a case where a ventriloquist named Maxwell Frere had shot another ventriloquist named Sylvester Key. Although Sylvester actually survived his injuries. He didn't die. Maxwell was insisting to everyone that he wasn't entirely responsible for what happened for reasons that become clearer as the story goes on. You see, Maxwell performed with a dummy named Hugo. And anyone who saw his act immediately noticed that Maxwell and Hugo had something of a contentious relationship. Like, Hugo was basically always talking about how lame Maxwell was and how he was gonna, like, take off and work with another ventriloquist. Like, I'm leaving you, you know what I mean? And it's funny because, I guess that would maybe be part of the shtick, but it's clearly not part of the shtick because it was, like, real awkward and uncomfortable. Actually, I think this angle, I may just be pulling this out of my ass, but this is what I thought. I thought this angle of the ventriloquist being berated by the dummy might have been a partial inspiration for the 1976 William Goldman novel Magic, which was, of course, turned into the excellent 1978 film starring Anthony Hopkins, which I have reviewed elsewhere on this channel. So one of Maxwell's shows, an American ventriloquist named Sylvester Key shows up, and he's just delighted by the act, particularly when Hugo starts talking to him directly and saying that he's going to ditch Maxwell and throw in his lot with him, right? Now, thinking, of course, that Maxwell is kind of indirectly asking him to collaborate, Sylvester goes back to Maxwell's dressing room after the show, but gets a little creeped out when Hugo, who is sitting alone on the sofa, seems to talk to him even though Maxwell is in the bathroom. Now, when Maxwell comes out, he doesn't appear to have any idea what Hugo said. Now, at this point, Sylvester still thinks that Maxwell is doing a bit, but for what purpose, he's not really sure. He becomes even less sure about this when he witnesses Maxwell getting his hand bitten, like when he tries to quiet Hugo down, like he puts his hand over Hugo's mouth and Hugo like bites him like a person would. And later in a hotel bar, Maxwell is really drunk and he gets his ass kicked when Hugo insults a woman who's there with like a male friend. Like the male comes over and punches him. Even though Maxwell is kind of mostly too drunk and he's slurring his words, but Hugo is like talking like normal. Now, Sylvester, who is staying in the same hotel, actually rescues Maxwell from himself And or from Hugo rather, I guess, and takes him upstairs to sleep it off, and he leaves Hugo the dummy at the foot of Maxwell's bed. Sometime during the night, though, Hugo disappears from the room, and Maxwell, who is livid, bursts into Sylvester's room, accusing the other ventriloquist of stealing Hugo. And then he basically starts shooting. He just fills Sylvester full of lead, you know what I mean? Now, like I said, Sylvester isn't killed, and he does actually visit Maxwell later in jail. Like, he seems like pretty chill about the whole thing, about, yeah, it's all right, you shot me, kind of thing. Now, Dr. Van Straten relates how he kind of surreptitiously took Hugo into the jail cell where Maxwell was being held because he wanted to see what would happen. And he said that he watched as Maxwell talked to Hugo as though Hugo was a separate person. And so he concluded that Maxwell was batshit crazy. So he gets thrown into an asylum, and then he just starts speaking in Hugo's voice. Now, after this story, Dr. Van Straten assures the others that he doesn't believe there was anything paranormal going on or that Hugo was actually alive. His opinion was that Maxwell just had like a split personality type thing going on and moved the dummy around himself without being aware of it. And then we come to the conclusion of the frame story, which has kind of been building up suspense this entire time with creepy little details like kind of dropped in between each of the stories. Now, Walter Craig had, as I mentioned, predicted a few things that ended up happening, like Sally's mother arriving unexpectedly to take her home, Dr. Van Straten breaking his glasses, stuff like that. And he also said that the dream didn't get really horrifying until after a man told him about the death of another man he didn't know. Now, this particular prediction was seemingly met when Elliot told the story about Larry drowning himself, but nothing terrible happened after that point. So Dr. Van Straten thinks the whole thing is just complete hogwash, right? Now, Walter tries to get the doctor to leave before the terrible thing happens, but the doctor does not heed this warning. Now, with Sally gone, because like I said, her mom came and got her, Elliot and Joan both go upstairs for different reasons, like to get something or whatever, leaving Walter and Dr. Van Straten alone in the creepy, dark parlor. Now, Walter tells the doctor that he should have left when he was warned, but now it's too late to stop what's going to happen. Now, Walter, presumably under the influence of some greater force or something, then strangles the doctor to death. Now, you might think that that's the end of the movie, but again, not so fast. Right after the murder, Walter wakes up in what we're led to assume is his own bed at home. His wife is there, and he tells her that he got a phone call about a renovation job, and he has to go out to this country house he's never been to meet with the homeowner. And then we see him driving up the long road to the house from the beginning of the movie, and thus the loop starts over. I will note that Walter mentioned during the course of the movie that he had the nightmare about the house all the time, but that he always started to forget it, like as soon as he woke up. So the audience is kind of left wondering whether his dream has predicted like the coming events, like this is happening for real now, or if he's just beginning the nightmare cycle like all over again. So if you're at all a fan of British Golden Age horror, and particularly a fan of anthologies, then I feel like this is kind of a must-see, like for horror fans. Obviously, it's dated by today's standards. It's from 1945, and it likely won't hold any surprises because most of the stories have been told, you know, several times since then. But if you want to see an early example of a horror anthology, you know, done right, and one that was really influential, like I said, then you do kind of owe it to yourself to give Dead of Night a watch. It's actually like a really entertaining film. It's a tad uneven in places. Like I said, I could have done without the funny story, but the wraparound story is great, like about him having the dream about all the people and you trying to figure all of that out. And the haunted mirror and evil ventriloquist stories are, you know, a real treat as well. So, like I said, this is known as a classic for a reason, and if you haven't seen it, you probably should. So that will do it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please remember, like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you guys again on the next one. Happy Halloween.